Welcome into the Play-by-Play, a sports media talk show brought to you by Awful Announcing. I am your host today, Ben Axelrod. Joining me on the other side of the screen here is Drew Lerner. Drew, we don't really have time for like a cute intro here. We've got breaking news. We've got a lot of stuff I know you and I had already wanted to get to before all this came down. So let's just get into it, Drew. I feel like I've been avoiding you kind of for these last 15 minutes, even though we've also been working together on this because I wanted to save a lot of this conversation for the podcast. What's going on here?
Right. I mean, this was a shock to me when I saw the headline from Wall Street Journal, and then obviously went right to getting our story up for Awful Announcing. But, my first instincts on this was like, this makes a lot of sense, right? Warner Brothers Discovery has stuff that Paramount would want, and Paramount certainly has things that Warner Brothers Discovery would want in the form of a broadcast network. So if you think about a merged entity here, right? You're going to say, all right, we're putting HBO Max and Paramount together. Great. We're combining CBS News and CNN. Great. We're going to get all of the sports rights that Warner Brothers Discovery has currently. So we're talking college football playoff. We're talking the rest of the NCAA men's basketball tournament, MLB and NHL playoffs, NASCAR, French Open, college football. That's all stuff that would fit perfectly into CBS Sports' current portfolio, which quite honestly, if you think about it, is pretty light. They have, a little bit of college football. They have the NFL, of course. They have the March Madness. They have Masters. They have golf. But other than that, if we're talking tonnage here, their true tonnage sport is, like Champions League soccer. And, that's for Paramount Plus. So you bring in a lot of these sports properties from Warner Brothers Discovery. It bolsters the streaming service, and it also gives you a lot more programming to put on CBS. And we've all seen that, broadcast is king now when it comes to live sports, and you want to have more of that type of programming on your network.
Yeah, and you have UFC now on the Paramount side.
Exactly.
So you have it's weird because you're right. Just from a sports perspective, which is I think obviously where a lot of our minds went with this stuff is CBS has. Like they have the NFL, and the NFL is obviously king. And so they have the NFL, but their secondary sports, I mean, they brought in UFC and UFC like instantly jumped to becoming probably their number 2 sport, depending on your feelings about Champions League. So that part of it makes sense. And then you look at the Warner Brothers side, and they actually have like a fairly decent like secondary package. They don't have, without the NBA, they don't have the headliner, but they have a part of the baseball playoffs. They have March Madness, they have AEW wrestling, they have some NASCAR, some hockey. Like they have a solid secondary package, but they just don't have the headliner. So now you add in the NFL, you add in this massive UFC deal. Like this is a much more complete package for both sides, right?
100%. And we know consolidation is coming in this industry. So in order to compete, you're going to have scale. And there's going to be a lot of, calls from people in the media that say, this shouldn't get approved. This is, where these companies are becoming too big. They're going to have too much, market share. And, those concerns are valid, right? But we're talking about at this point in the media business, you need to have the scale to compete with Disney, Comcast, Amazon, Google. Like Warner Brothers Discovery and Paramount, even under new ownership, do not have that. This kind of reminds me a lot of like some of the mergers we've seen from distributors like Dish merging with I can't even remember, but the Dish merger, they needed the market share to be able to compete with, Comcast and DirecTV and all that. So it's like, this is kind of just what happened. Dish. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So this is what needs to happen if you're Warner Brothers Discovery, because let's be honest, like if you're splitting off your cable assets and you're kind of sending them out to die, like someone's going to buy those anyway. Perhaps, if you have a bidder like David Ellison that is willing to buy the whole package, you're probably going to maximize your value that way more so than, selling your company for parts. So I think this makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, and this is something they've been talking about a lot on one of the shows you and I often reference on this show, The Town with Matthew Bellany, the Puck Ringer Hollywood podcast. They've been talking about this. They were kind of under the impression like this was going to happen sooner than later with these particular pieces. And when it comes to the antitrust stuff, one thing they brought up, I think this week, was the key to it is that Warner Brothers Discovery does not have a broadcast channel, that they're not a broadcast news network. So that's like typically the big concern, right, in these cases. And so the fact that you aren't consolidating to broadcast networks, it does add to the idea that this is not, those antitrust things aren't necessarily, it makes it more likely, I think, that it gets approved. That would seem to be the hang up.
100%. And you also have to think, under new ownership, under David Ellison and Larry Ellison, we have an administration that is quite friendly with that family. So I don't think you're going to see the type of hang up you did when we saw this Paramount Skydance merger, where, the Trump administration might be trying to pull some strings and get some concessions out of Paramount. I think this is going to be a much more favorable environment for Paramount to work in and get this deal done. And quite frankly, I think our listeners might care more about like what this means to, them and their sports viewing habits. And if I'm being honest, I think this is a good thing for consumers. So, when we're talking about antitrust, regulations and guardrails, like those are supposed to be pro-consumer. Consumers are clamoring for an easier way to consume these products, right? And so if you're putting these two companies together, now you're putting it under one umbrella, you're going to get it all in one streaming service under one company. That's better than subscribing to one, Paramount Plus and HBO Max and whatever TNT sports streamer is going to, this kind of puts everything together. And I think that's a win for consumers.
So real quick, the split that you've been writing about, the split between Warner Brothers Discovery, the streaming services and the Hollywood, and then the cable assets, like that would just be done. Like there would be no split. Paramount would be buying the whole thing outright.
Right. Yeah. This is what the Wall Street Journal is reporting. And it's kind of funny because yesterday, David Zaslav, the CEO of Warner Brothers Discovery, was on stage at a Goldman Sachs conference discussing the timeline of the split and saying, it's going to be done in April 2026, which to me made sense. And I'm sure that's still on the table if this deal can't get done. But, April 2026 makes sense because you're going to do it after TNT airs the Final Four this year and also the national championship game for March Madness. So obviously people rely on HBO Max for that viewing of those sports. So, yeah, that timeline made sense. But if this deal is going to get done, I mean, it wouldn't happen that quick. But that split is off the table.
Are the Ellisons just about to own everything? Like I think Larry just overtook Elon Musk as the richest person in the world. They just complete the Paramount purchase. Now they're looking at Warner. Like this is a lot of things happening for somebody who we were not writing about like 6 months ago.
Yeah, I'm probably not that person to ask about that, but it sure seems like they want to be like a huge player in the media space, and this is probably the best way to do it, right? You bought Paramount, which has the broadcast network, and now look at what's on the market. Not even just Warner Brothers Discovery, but think about Versant. Like if they wanted to, they could put in a bid for Versant. They could own all of the PGA Tour inventory. They could own, Premier League soccer inventory, which would, go well with, their streaming service and their Champions League inventory. I mean, this could just be the start of things. You're right.
What last thing? What is the most interesting thing we haven't talked about? What I can tell you're super geeked out about this right now.
Oh, dude,
what
what
do you want to say about this?
Yeah, I just think
what has you pumped?
What has me pumped is like for the first 9 months of the Trump administration, we haven't seen this type of deal happen yet. And it was all widely expected. Once Trump gets in office, like the regulatory environment's going to be ripe for these types of consolidations. And, we just hadn't seen it. And I thought Fox personally was the biggest contender. I know I'd written about this. Other analysts had written about this, with all the uncertainty that was going on with their family trust, which also ironically got resolved this week. It made a lot of sense that they would be on the market for these types of deals. But now that is kind of put to the side, this I think makes a lot of sense. And I'm just happy that we're getting some more M&A, some more transactions in the industry, because ultimately, there are arguments that say, this could be bad long term, but I think in the short to medium term, this is going to be really consumer friendly, and this is really quite necessary for the industry.
Yeah, love a good M&A. All right, let's push this forward, because otherwise we'll be talking about this the rest of the show, and we've got other stuff we want to get to. We came out this week with our list of the 25 most influential sports media members of the last 25 years. I've got it pulled up here. I think at this point I can probably give it away without, diverting any traffic we'd be getting otherwise. In order here, we've got number 1, Bill Simmons, Stephen A. Smith, Charles Barkley, Tony Kornheiser and Michael Wilbon, Adam Schefter and Adrian Wojnarowski, Scott Van Pelt, Doris Burke, Dave Portnoy, Pat McAfee, Aaron Andrews, Skip Bayless, Joe Buck, Bob Costas, Kirk Herbstreit, Jim Nance, Dan Patrick, Stuart Scott, Mina Kimes, Dan Lebitard, Mike Florio, the Pardon My Take guys, Tony Romo, Michael Strahan, Ernie Johnson, and Colin Cowherd. I guess it was interesting coming up with this. This was something we put together as kind of our editorial board who comes up with these sorts of things. We drafted a list. The initial list did not wind up being this list. Obviously, we debated it. We should have just screen grabbed those Slack debates that we had, because I think those were really, interesting and insightful, and really could have been a podcast in and of themselves. It's interesting though, because you come up with the list and there are 15, I'd say 12 to 15 names that just have to be on there that we didn't even discuss in terms of debating. And then you have to come up with the rest of the list. And that's probably, I think it, ultimately it came down to probably just the final 4 or 5 spots, where we really had tough conversations about it. But I don't know what stood out to you about the list. What stood out to you about this process, and what did you make of this as a whole?
I like the idea, and it gets very interesting, and obviously this is kind of why it gets a lot of engagement. Is you can talk about the word influential in a lot of ways. There's a lot of ways you can influence sports media. So I think a lot of our debates were kind of centered around that. Is X person did they actually have any meaningful change on the sports media industry? And when I look back at the list, and I've had a few days to process what people have been saying about it and all that, I kind of all positive. I would say my one regret is I think we gave the play-by-play people a little too much love, because I think a lot of them are just kind of products of the play-by-play announcers that came before them. There's not too many that have truly changed the way sports are being broadcast or sports are being called in this day and age. So I think we could have afforded to, bump Joe Buck down a little, bump Jim Nance down a little. I don't know if I would take them off the list entirely, but that was, kind of what stood out to me when I was looking this list over. And if I had to change anything, that would probably be where my head is at.
Yeah, I think I probably had a similar reaction. I'm also just typically drawn to the personalities, and I think the personalities typically provide that sort of influence, whereas play-by-play has, there have been good play-by-play guys, great play-by-play guys, but it's largely been the same job throughout its history. There's not too many revolutionary play-by-play guys in this current century. I think that was also another part of it, is limiting it to this century and deciding like, hey, was this this person was influential, but was the influential part about them more in the Mike and the Mad Dog were right on the cusp. They were on like one of our final drafts of the list. And it came down to like they were more 90s guys than they were necessarily 2000s guys. And I think even looking at this, our list now, like, you know, I see at least 4 or 5 names we probably could have had that discussion a little bit longer about. But ultimately, like, I like the list. I'm satisfied with the list. It's not, you know, if I was writing this myself, it's not the list I would have came up with, but by and large, like, it's everybody on it. I definitely has a case. And I think, you know, probably our 10 people who were on the outside looking in all had a case too. So it's just, again, how do you measure like what's influential? How do you measure what that influence was in the 21st century? And ultimately, like, how much influence was there? So, I mean, we're not going to go by this all 25 guys, but the top of our list, one of the debates we did have was Bill Simmons or Stephen A. Smith for number 1 overall. And we voted on it, and I think pretty unanimously settled on Bill Simmons as number 1. I felt strongly about that one. I feel like as a sports website and a sports blog, and, you know, a website that writes about non-traditional things, like, Bill Simmons is kind of our godfather. Like, our website probably doesn't exist
Our
without
podfather.
our podfather doesn't exist with our site doesn't exist without the influence that Bill Simmons had in the early 2000s in the internet space. So I'm very deferential to him when it comes to that. But where did you shake out on that part of the debate?
Yeah, you know, I definitely sided on the Bill Simmons side of things, and I think it's more kind of like you said, just taking a holistic look at sports media. You know, Stephen A. Smith has had a profound impact on one part of sports media, which is debate television, and that's why he's number 2, right? Because you see that's the format that dominates, you know, television programming, studio programming in this day and age. Bill Simmons has, you know, expanded far outside of that, right? He's done the 30 for 30s. He's done other documentaries. He does the podcasts. He has the written content on The Ringer. I feel like his influence is just a bit more wide ranging than Stephen A. Smith. And, you know, he's locked down, you know, the largest sports podcast in the country for quite some time. As far as I know, you know, I'm sure there's others up there, but, you know, the longevity of his podcast is also something to be considered. And if we're thinking about the time period, 2000 to 2025, you know, he was influential long before Stephen A. Smith became the character he is today. So I think all those things kind of gave Simmons the edge for me.
Who, like, we all came into it, I think, with like, if we were going to make our own list, like, these are the people we are like pretty passionate about making sure get on this list. Like, there are some people who, if we didn't have them on that list, like, I would have been legitimately like upset and like not, I wouldn't feel like it was like I just felt very passionate about having these people on the list. I know, you know who mine was. Who was yours for that?
I'm actually, I can't remember who yours is, but for me, it was Florio. And this is also a bit of a homer pick because we work for a sports blog, but you know, Florio is also one of those people that changed the game, right? Like, he is always out there, is, you know, probably having a dozen separate written posts on his website every day. He doesn't have to be doing this. He has a TV job, a podcasting job, you know, he doesn't need to be writing about like the minute happenings day to day in the NFL, but he still does. And he kind of he kind of, you know, fathered in the format that we like to, you know, copy here at Awful Announcing, which is, you know, we're going to be a clearinghouse for every little bit of sports media news out there, just like Florio is the clearinghouse for every bit of NFL news out there. So I think a lot of, you know, the sports blogosphere has kind of emulated what Florio did with Pro Football Talk. And he's just a bit of a more unique figure when you look at all the people on that list. And I think his influence is pretty profound on the industry.
Yeah, I love Mike Florio. I think he is somebody also who easily could have flown under the radar for us. And like if we left him off there probably wouldn't have been like a big outcry for like where is Mike Florio. But I also think he's a name that when people saw it, they were probably like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like that's everybody in the NFL reads Mike Florio. And yeah, I mean, to your point, like not to toot our own horns, but there are a lot of talk shows and a lot of podcasts that I know go to awful announcing and they find that's where they want to, because they know we have everything. We're covering everything in the sports media space the same way Mike Florio is covering everything, obviously on a much bigger scale in the NFL space. And so he definitely, I think, laid that blueprint for websites like ours. So yeah, I think that would have been a big omission not to have him on there. Mine is probably maybe surprising because it's not somebody who like you would think Ben Axelrod is like a huge fan of, just in terms of like I don't know whatever people think about me, but Erin Andrews was mine. Like I think that was one because she, um, I think people forget like what a huge star she was. She still is obviously a huge star. I mean, she just did the sideline for the Super Bowl. Like she is one of the, if not the top sideline reporters. But that was such a trailblazer like job that she did in the early 2010s, doing the job that she did when she was at ESPN and then obviously later at Fox. I mean, I think there is an entire generation of sideline reporters who went to college saying, I want to be the next Erin Andrews. I think the way that she made sports more relatable to women at large, I think that's a massive influence. I think you look at what she's done with her fashion and her podcast and things away from her traditional job. I think you could say she laid the blueprint for like a lot of the influencers that we see in the sports space. So I think she doesn't always get the recognition that she deserves as a trailblazer in this industry. And I also think like I was like passionate, like, hey, she needs to be on this list, and she like should probably be higher than she should be lower.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that. And I did see like a fair amount of feedback that was like Erin Andrews at 10. Like, why is Erin Andrews at 10? But
That
I
was too
think
low
people
for me.
forget. Yeah, like you laid it out perfectly. Like she inspired like an entire generation of young women to get into sports journalism, become sideline reporters, become just reporters. You know, it, she was kind of the first like household name that was like a women's sports broadcaster on like one of the most prominent, sports productions in the country. So I think there's a lot to be said for Erin Andrews.
Who's the name we left off that you're like, man, we could have had that one on here?
There's a couple that I'll give, and the way, like I was saying, the way I see it is like I'm looking at people that kind of changed the industry, like had an actual tangible impact on how sports media is covered or how sports media like behaves at this point in time. So, I saw Matthew Berry was left off the list. He was on one of our preliminary lists. I think he would have been a fine addition because he kind of pioneered some of the fantasy football and just fantasy gaming and betting content that we see plenty of today. And the other one I think is a fair omission or fair to bring up here is Clay Travis, because Travis has had a not to keep repeating myself, but a profound impact on how people view the sports media landscape. He's a bit more of like a political figure than he is a sports figure, in my opinion. So I think that was kind of the reason we left him off the list, in its final form. But if you kind of pay attention to how just regular people view sports media, I think he's had a really huge influence on that, especially in the way people perceive ESPN. And, I don't know if I would credit Travis for, changing the way ESPN has gone about its production of stuff. But, I think there's some probably halo effect there where ESPN sees some of that type of commentary and the support that it gets and has probably made some decisions one way or another based off of that. So I do think he's someone who should have been strongly considered as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this about Clay, and he tweeted about the list. Not a fan of our list. We debated him. I mean, we had a conversation about him. He I don't know if we ever got to the point where he was on a draft, but he was definitely somebody we strongly considered. I think there was a case for him. I also don't have a problem with him being left off. Mainly, I'll say another thing about this list, like not to make excuses. 25 is a really small number for
Yeah.
a quarter century, and to span all the parts of sports media. It's tough. There are a lot of names. I think Matthew Berry should have been on there. I think Darren Rovell should have been on there. Those would be like kind of my two who I would have picked, just because I've always been drawn to people who cover non-traditional avenues of the industry. And to that end, like, say what you will about Clay. I know we've said plenty in the past on our site. He created the leading conservative sports media website and sold it to a big company in Fox, and was on a national show. And I think we could have had him on the list, and it would have been totally justified. And I also think, like I said, the list had to stop somewhere. And ultimately, the way it shook out, I also don't have a huge issue with him being left off of it, but he was in the conversation. I think, if anybody did this exercise, he would probably be around that cutoff point for them. So it
Yeah,
is what it
for
is.
sure.
But
I think to me the discrepancy comes like, did you change the industry or did you change how people perceive the industry? And
mhm,
I think he changed how a lot of people perceive a
yeah,
lot of the bigger sports media companies out there, like ESPN, like I mentioned. But I don't know if he's changed like how people
yeah.
produce content in the sports media space, or what kind of content's coming out. So that, to me, that was kind of the distinguishing factor for him.
And I also think there is some overlap with him and other people like Dave Portnoy who are on the list. And so it's like, if we already have that, you know what I'm saying? Like, if we already have that avenue of the influence covered, like, why are we doing somebody who also influenced it, but in a similar manner? So I don't know. Like I
Right.
said, he was in the conversation, but yeah,
Yeah.
wanted
In a
wanted to.
similar vein, I was in for like combining Skip Bayless with Stephen A. Smith for that reason, because I thought their influence was like pretty
Yeah,
overlapping, but there were some detractors on that.
that was a tough one for me too, because it was like, because you raised that point. You said, let me hear the case for Skip Bayless. And I was of the same opinion. I was like, there are other people who like did the debate thing better and really brought it to more prominence, but he also was one of the first to do it. And he also, like, I don't think we get this iteration of Stephen A without Skip Bayless. I think that's been pretty well established. So if Stephen A. Smith was at the point where he was in the conversation at one point to be number one on our list, then it's like Skip does have to be on there, I think, somewhere. Yeah, we could have combined them though. That's probably valid. But also the other part, real quick, it's tough to deal with the recency bias, right? Because there is
Right.
like, we're covering 25, 26 years here, and there's also an inherent recency bias that we're all dealing with. But that's look, none of these lists are going to be perfect. I'm proud of the one we put together, and I stand by it. So real quick, let's get out of here on this. The ratings for Wake Up Barstool came out this week.
Yeah.
Averaged 16,500 through its first 4 episodes, which comprised the first week, obviously with Labor Day cutting that a day short. None of them topped 20,000, doing a little bit better on YouTube, but nothing stellar. What did you make of these numbers? Because even Dave Portnoy admitted on his unnamed show today they were awful.
Yeah, they were pretty awful. Like, I was looking at the year over year numbers, which I think you put in one of your pieces. Breakfast Ball into the facility, like, well over doubled the Barstool audience on the year ago dates in 2024. And when I was looking back to, like, during football season, the facility and Breakfast Ball would pretty regularly eclipse 100,000 viewers. So, like, this was substantially lower than those shows were getting at the same time last year. But that being said, I don't think Fox really cares. Like, I think you sign up for a Barstool show because you want to own the digital space. Their fans are online. They're not watching FS1 at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday. So I think they accomplished in their first week what they wanted to accomplish. Dave Portnoy made headlines from the show. There were some viral clips. Portnoy is on their, Saturday college football show now. So I think I said this in a previous podcast, there could be 0 people or 10 people that watch this show on linear television, and I think Fox would still think it's a good deal. So yeah, I don't think Fox is going to be overly concerned with this, but the viewership was really freaking dreadful.
Yeah, it's not surprising because it has nothing to do really with the quality of the show. I actually find the show to be fairly enjoyable. I think Brandon Walker is really entertaining on it. I think T-Bob Herbert's done a great job. He's kind of been the main host. It's a good show to put on in the background and a lot less in your face than some of the other sports morning shows are. Get Up and First Take, obviously it's not like a total embrace debate show. It's just guys chilling and talking about sports and being laid back and stuff. And the thing though is if you're a Barstool fan, which is obviously who this show is expects to be its baseline audience, this is the 4th or 5th thing all of these guys are doing. And it's very clear it's none of their priorities. I don't think it's Fox's priority. It reminds me of when Bill Simmons would do those Grantland basketball hours on ESPN. And I'm a huge Bill Simmons fan. And I think at the start, it's okay, I'll DVR them. I'll catch up on them later. And by the end, it's this is not the stuff Bill really cares about. And this is not the medium that Bill Simmons works in. And this is not the medium that Barstool works in. So it's not surprising to me that it's not working from a rating standpoint. The numbers do seem very low. So you don't think there's any bottom in terms of where Fox would be hey, we need to put something on here.
I don't know. I've seen some of the FS2 ratings for horse racing and stuff, and it's pretty similar. America's Day of the Races is getting 13,000 viewers on FS2, which when's the last time you've watched anything on FS2, Ben? So
I don't think I have it.
Yeah, it's down in the true dumps of sports TV ratings. It's probably going to be around BN Sports in terms of where your average audience is in that hour. But no, it's probably not that bad. But yeah, no, I truly don't think they care. And I think it's more likely that this show grows over time than shrinks even further down. You got to think there's probably 13,000 households that just for whatever reason have FS1 on at any given time in the day. So yeah, I don't think it's going to go below this. And if they can grow on it, fine. But I don't think it really matters.
Yeah, that was one of my kind of harebrained theories about it. Was it's a tough show to put on at airport bars, which is where a lot of these shows just exist, because it's literally just 4 guys sitting around talking. There's no highlights. You're obviously, if you're in a situation like that, you're not getting the audio. At least with First Take and Get Up, there's highlights. It's much more it's a brighter show. It's a dimly lit show, the Barstool show is. So I don't know. It's there's just not. Again, I think it's fine, but it's not a draw, and obviously it's a
podcast. And it's not a video podcast at that. So you're right. It doesn't really make sense to have it on at the airport bar compared to First Take.
Yeah, well, we will see. If Dave said they're going to make changes, or he's going to continue to tinker with it. They trimmed his Monday show down from 4 panelists to 3. So we'll see. Maybe it'll just be Dave Portnoy by the end of the month here, by the end of football season. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Play-by-Play. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe, leave a rating, leave a review, tell a friend. We will be back with you next week, breaking down all the latest in sports media.